Hi gang, the Gathering Storm campaign was in many ways the origin story of modern Warhammer 40k, introducing new characters, new factions, a whole new galaxy, and for the first time, a central advancing storyline featuring the same characters over and over again, something that wasn't really a thing in 40k before that. So in this video, I'm going to retell the story of Gathering Storm and find out just how the galaxy changed at the end of the 41st millennium. Gathering Storm was released throughout 2017 as the final arc of the 7th edition of Warhammer 40k. Its 3 books, Fall of Cadia, Fracture of Biel-Tan, and Rise of the Primarch, tied together plot threads that have been present in the lore for decades, introduced new characters with new in-game rules, and fundamentally changed the setting. For most of its history, 40k had been very clearly a sandbox setting rather than an ongoing story. The official date was forever held at the end of the 41st millennium, and the stories and events depicted by Games Workshop happened at various points in the 1,000 or so years before then. And this is still the case, that's still all possible and still all written about, but Gathering Storm introduced an actual advancing storyline with main characters that allowed them to bring about quite big changes to many of the factions. It's from the events of this series that we get the 40k we know now, the embattled Imperium led by the Primaris Marines and Robert Guilliman, struggling to hold itself together as it's split asunder by the Great Rift. But that whole story begins with something a bit more familiar to veteran players, with the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler. This conflict, featured before in 40k, was part of a massed assault by the forces of Chaos on the galaxy. For 10,000 years since the dark days of the Horus Heresy, the forces of the Chaos Space Marines have been largely confined to the Eye of Terror, a cursed area of the galaxy where real space and the warp cross over, suffused with the power of chaos and full of strange inhabitants and demon worlds. And for millennia, the Imperium of Man's main bulwark against raids from the Eye was the fortress world of Cadia that stood sentinel at the end of the Cadian Gate, the only stable route in and out of the Eye. The forces of Cadia, a world dedicated entirely to military service, patrolled and guarded the gate, but they were always sorely pressed. Raids frequently slipped past the patrols, and 12 times prior, great Black Crusades had forced their way through the gate, descending on the galaxy as the forces of Chaos searched out potent new artifacts to continue their long war with the Imperium. But the 13th Black Crusade descended on Cadia itself. I tell this story in a bit more detail in my video on Cadia, but the 13th Black Crusade was colossal. The forces of Chaos pushing through the Cadian Gate and sweeping aside the Imperial battle fleet in its path, thousands upon thousands of heretic Astartes, mortal traitors, and their demon allies laying siege to the fortress cities on Cadia itself. The Cadians were betrayed from within, their leadership wiped out by the turncoat Volskani cataphracts, and so overall command had fallen to Ursakar E. Creed, commanding officer of the Cadian 8th and now Lord Castellan of Cadia. Calls went out to all corners of the Imperium for reinforcement, and both the Imperium and the forces of Chaos poured resources into the war. Forces from the Space Wolves, Dark Angels, Imperial Fists, and many other Space Marine chapters arrived to aid the defense, along with regiments of the Astra Militarum, representatives of the Inquisition leading Tempestus Scion kill teams, and the Holy Ordos of the Sisters of Battle, led by Celestine, the Living Saint. And on the Chaos side, fleet upon fleet continued to pour out from the Eye, eventually led by the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity. But one of the new arrivals wasn't responding to this request for aid. Instead, he'd been set upon his mission by far stranger figures. Eldrad Ulthran, Farseer of the Eldar craft world Ulthwé, had been manipulating the threads of fate for some time in an attempt to save his dying species from extinction. The ancient Eldari had been waning for 10,000 years, since the fall of their great empire and the formation of the Eye of Terror itself, their souls guarded in various ways lest they be consumed by the chaos power they created, Slaanesh. But there was a great legend told by the Eldar that within the infinity circuits of their craft worlds, where the souls of dead Eldar were kept safe from Slaanesh, a great power was growing that would save them all. Inyad, the god of the dead, was predicted to wake up when the final Eldar died and entered the Infinity Circuit, but that wasn't soon enough for Eldrad Ulthran. Foreseeing the wars to come, Eldrad attempted a ritual on the crystal moon of Coheria that would awaken Inyad early, but the ritual was disrupted by Space Marines of the Death Watch before it could be completed. With this new god only partially awakened, Eldrad turned to the strands of fate again and sent his agents out into the galaxy to ensure that the pieces were all in the right place for the power of Inyad to be brought forth. One of these agents was Silandri Veilwalker, spirit seer of the Masked Sorrow Harlequin troupe, and her first stop was Mars. The Archmagos Belisarius Cawl had not left Mars in some time. For thousands of years he'd been cloistered in his great forge, attempting to complete his great work, when finally the Shadowseer appeared to him. "The time is now," she whispered to him. "Time to take the great relic he'd been working on and deliver it to its intended destination." But on the way to make the delivery, the Acquisitor fleet of Cawl became distracted by rumours of deep caverns full of Archaeotech on the planet of Eriad 6. Making planetfall, his Skitarii forces became bogged down in a brutal war against orcs as Cawl, encouraged again by Veilwalker, pushed further and further into the planet's depths, studying the strange black stone obelisks he found fractured into pieces all across the planet. Eventually, as he tracked down a complete obelisk, he realised that it was the same sort of structure that existed on Cadia, the famous Cadian pylons that were known to hold back the warp. And furthermore, that the pylons of Eriad had been destroyed deliberately by a Chaos fleet during a previous Black Crusade. That, he realised, was Abaddon's centuries-long plan, and that was why the current Black Crusade was targeting Cadia. They wanted to destroy the pylons. So, reluctantly, he left Eriad 6 to the Orcs and diverted his fleet again. Meanwhile, Veilwalker was elsewhere, in the dark city of Camorra, as Drubael Vecht was having a nice evening watching lethal gladiatorial combat in his arena. At the insistence of Veilwalker, a new combatant had been permitted to enter the bout. The former Craftworld Aspect Warrior turned Corsair Pirate Queen turned Drakari Succubus, Ivrain. She held her own, even against the queen of the arena, Lelith Hesperax, but eventually she was cut down by an ancient priestess of the Eldar crone goddess, Morai Heg. But as she teetered between life and death, she was filled with the power of Inyad. Her wounds healed and her huskblade transformed into Kavir, the Sword of Sorrows, one of the 5 crone swords of Eldar legend. Vecht, realising this would be an asset worth keeping, mobilised his troops, and Kabbalite warriors descended into the arena to capture this new power, but Ivrain fought them off, first with the aid of her blood brides, and then with the intervention of a figure known as the Vizarch, her former Aspect Warrior Exarch from the Craft Worlds, turned Incubi Clavex in Camorra, who'd been following her in secret, it turned out. As a great disjunction ruptured the webway around Camorra and the whole city mobilised to capture her, the small band made for the docks, where Ivrain's former Corsair allies waited. Her ship, the Lanathrial, was harried by blade-like Drakari fighters as it attempted to depart the Dark City, eventually ramming its prow into one of the minor webway portals that orbited the city, and Ivrain and her allies escaped into the webway on foot. Lost in the twisting paths of the webway, the Drakari in the band started to feel the pull of the warp on their souls, and desperate they pushed further and further, eventually stumbling through a new portal and into an area of the webway corrupted by Slaanesh. The group were outnumbered twice over by demonettes led by the Mask of Slaanesh itself, but as blood brides and incubi started to collapse from the soporific musk of She Who Thirsts, they were saved by the Harlequins of the Midnight Sorrow, who pushed back the demons and forced them to retreat, sealing the cursed portal behind them. And while the troop departed on their next inscrutable mission, their solitaire remained with Ivrain to guide them on the next stage of their quest. When Belisarius Cawl's fleet arrived at Cadia, things were looking bad for the defenders, and they weren't too pleased when his forces, instead of reinforcing the besieged Khazars, diverted to the great pylon networks on the Elysian fields. But at length, Cawl managed to convince Creed, Celestine, and the rest of the defenders of the truth, that Abaddon's mission was the destruction of the Cadian pylons, and that this must be stopped at any cost. The Imperials dug in for the final assault as Khal in the catacombs beneath the pylons attempted to unlock their secret. The Chaos Assault was furious. Abaddon himself led it at the head of his Terminator bodyguard, the Bringers of Despair, and slowly the defense lines crumbled before them and the forces of Chaos pushed their way into the caverns beneath, barely held off by a counterattack by Celestine and the Order of Our Martyred Lady. But the Imperials had help in all this from an unexpected ally. Far away on the museum world of Solemnus, the Necron Lord Trazyn the Infinite had been alerted to the great changes sweeping across the galaxy when the great Bell of St. Gerstal, liberated millennia ago for display in his museum, started to toll uncontrollably, doing great damage to the other exhibits. Annoyed by the inconvenience of this, Trazyn dumped the bell in the webway, but he heeded the warning and consulted the celestial orrery on the Necron world of Thanatos, locating the source of the corruption. Trazyn had no master but himself and no real fear of the warp, but playing at Saviour felt like an amusing distraction, so he selected some choice items from his collection and departed for Cadia, appearing to Khal deep in the catacombs and offering to show him how to unlock the pylons. As the two worked, the great battle raged outside. The Imperial defenders pushed back from every angle by the forces of the Despoiler. To buy them more time, Trazyn opened up the Tesseract vaults he'd selected from Solemnus, and mine-shackled Imperial forces emerged from their stasis. Companies of Ultramarines thought lost since the dark days of the Horus Heresy, regiments of Vostroyan Astra Militarum, Tanith sharpshooters, and squads of salamanders joining the battle. Only the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor, Katarina Greyfax, leading her Scion bodyguard from the 55th Capic Eagles, held their fire until they knew where they were and who the true enemy was. Eventually, as the Living Saint and the Despoiler dueled at the center of the battle, Khal and Trazyn managed to activate the ancient pylon network. Black lightning pulsed from the pylons, beaming from Cadia into the heart of the eye and causing it to start to shrink. Abaddon's demon forces on the surface disintegrated, Psykers felt their powers sucked away, and even the Living Saint stumbled, her power diminished. Almost cut down by Abaddon, she was saved by the intervention of Inquisitor Greyfax, who put aside her revulsion at this obvious warp abomination calling itself a saint for the sake of Imperial morale. As the defenders finally rallied, Abaddon gave the order to withdraw. But the respite here was short-lived. As the defenders consolidated their forces, Abaddon enacted his last attempt to destroy the pylons. The remains of the Blackstone fortress Will of Eternity, rendered inoperable earlier in the war by the Imperial Fist's fortress monastery Phalanx, were driven into the planet itself, breaking the crust and destroying the pylon fields utterly. The planet began to break apart, millions of attackers and defenders lost in great firestorms as Abaddon's plan finally succeeded, and with nothing to hold it back, the Eye of Terror slowly began to expand into a great rift across the whole galaxy. This rift would continue to grow over the next few years, more and more planets lost to it or confused by the scar appearing in their skies. Warp storms descended across the Imperium, making communication and travel extremely hazardous in an event called the Blackness, in one case even blotting out the light of the Astronomicon. With the destruction of Cadia, the defenders escaped as best they could, Creed and the Cadian 8th holding a rearguard action to buy the rest time. Celestine, led by visions from the Emperor, pulled together a ragged group of forces. Her battle sisters, the Inquisitor Greyfax, the Black Templars of Marshal Amalric, and the Knights of House Taranis departed alongside Khal on his Arch Mechanicus, the Iron Revenant, and they attempted to escape the Chaos fleet surrounding the dying planet. Meanwhile, things had been moving swiftly amongst the Eldari. Silandri Veilwalker and the Midnight Sorrow had visited the craft world of Biel Tan, convincing its leaders to heed Eldrad Ulthran's visions. The Daughter of Shades, Ivrain, could hold the key to saving the Eldari race, but she was in danger from the forces of Slaanesh, who even now were planning an attack on Biel Tan itself. The maiden world of Ursulia had long fallen to chaos, and its webway portal that led to the craft world had been sealed. But the Mask of Slaanesh had tricked Skarbrand, a demon prince of Khorne, into a contest on the planet, with the aim of using his great strength to breach that webway portal. The Sword Wind of Biel Tan mobilized to Ursulia to try and stop this, but they failed and the portal was breached anyway, the forces of Slaanesh swarming into the webway. In defeat, the Craftworld forces destroyed the gate completely before racing back home. But they were too late. The demons tore through Biel-Tan, the Mask of Slaanesh reaching into the heart of the craft world and infecting its infinity circuit. The only thing that kept the souls of the dead Eldar from being lost to the warp. The Phoenix Lord Jane Zar drove her from the throne room, and the returning Biel-Tan forces forced the demons back into the warp, but the great world ship of Biel-Tan had been infected by Slaanesh, and it was dying. And it was into this that Ivrain's band arrived, led by the Solitaire. Supported by Jane Zar, she addressed the assembled leaders of Biel-Tan, claiming that Yniad was waking, and to waken fully and save the Eldari, the 5 ancient crone swords of Morai Heg needed to be reunited. She had one, and a second was buried within the bones of Biel-Tan itself. Against the protests of the assembled Biel-Tani, she plunged her red gauntlet into the wraithbone of the craft world, pulling forth Asuvar, the Sword of Silent Screams, and summoning the Avatar of Yniad, the Incarn. The infection of Slaanesh had already turned parts of the craft world to ash, and the drawing forth of the sword didn't help. Biel-Tan started to break apart, the ancient ships that made it up separating from the whole, and its bone singers doing their best to stop the damage and to transplant the souls within into spirit stones and then into wraithbone constructs. Warp storms unleashed by the summoning of the Incarn boiled around the craft world, offering no escape. But unseen allies showed themselves again as, on faraway Ulthwi, Eldrad Ulthran opened a portal to allow Ivrain to escape. What follows is essentially a romp around the Eldar craft world, with Ivrain and her new Inari picking up more and more followers at every turn. Eldrad Ulthran would be banished from Ulthwé for his reckless actions, but supported by emissaries from the craft world Altansar, Ivrain's mission continued as she led her forces to recover another of the Crone Swords on the Crone world of Belial 5 deep within the warp. Ambushed at first by the forces of the Drakari, who were still chasing her since Camorra, and then by the demons of Slaanesh, the Inari, the Harlequins of the Mars Sorrow, and the warriors of Ulthwé were saved by forces dispatched from the craft world Iyanden. Armed with the new Crone Sword, Vilith Zar, they returned to Iyanden to find it under siege by the plague fleets of Nurgle, who were beaten back by Ivrain's Corsair allies, and the Corsair Prince of Iyanden, Uriel, who was saved by the power of Yniad and his Spear of Twilight identified as the 4th of the Crone Swords. Their ranks bolstered by hundreds of wraith constructs from Iyanden, given new purpose by Yniad, the Inari plunged back into the Webway, guided by the Harlequins once again, but in the great Webway nexus known as the Psyche Delta they came under attack from the Thousand Suns, led by Ahriman, and were only saved by the intervention of the Phoenix Lords of Eldar myth. Finally, as the last stages of this running battle played out, the visions of Eldrad guided them to their next destination, the ice world of Cleistus, near the fallen imperial system of Cadia. They emerged into another running battle. The Celestinian Crusade, as it was now known, led by the Living Saints' visions, had eventually abandoned their ships in orbit and, harried by the Black Legion, fought through the snow of Cleistus to reach the mysterious Xenos Gate at its centre. As the Eldari forces finally pushed back Abaddon's legion, the Eldar and the Imperials came to an uneasy truce. The Saints' visions had led her here, and only the Eldar knew how to navigate the Webway any further, so there was no choice but to join forces. Their next destination would finally be to deliver the great artifact Khal had been working on for all those years and had transported with him since he left Mars. They were going to Ultramar. The Space Marine Protectorate of Ultramar was under attack already. The Despoiler had dispatched forces to hold the Ultramarines at bay, and their chapter master Marneus Calgar had led a dogged defense of the Macragge system. When the Inari and the Celestinian Crusade emerged on the world of Laphis at the edge of the system, they immediately came under attack by Chaos forces, the Knights of Taranis fighting flights of Helldrakes as they made their way to the nearest Ultramarines garrison. There, Celestine and Greyfax convinced the warriors of their need for passage, and the leaders of the crusade made their way to Macragge. Celestine, Khal, Greyfax, Ivrain and the Visarch boarding the strike cruiser Sword of Honour, as the rest of the Ynnari left to spread the word of Yniad throughout the Eldar. Arriving at Macragge, they were presented to the leaders of the defence. First, Captain Agamon, Grandmaster Voldus of the Grey Knights, and Marneus Calgar, and Khal demanded access to the shrine of Robert Guilliman himself. The Primarch had been held in stasis for 10,000 years after suffering a mortal wound at the hand of his brother, the demon Primarch Fulgrim. Seconds from death, the stasis fields could never be turned off. Calgar initially dismissed the request, but his chief librarian, Tigurius, spoke in defense of the pilgrims, and Greyfax spoke on behalf of the Inquisition, and eventually he relented. But as the group made their way to the shrine of the Primarch and the Archmagos Call's auto-reliquary took up position in front of the stasis fields, Chaos forces struck, blasting their way into the fortress of Hera. The Ultramarines, Inquisitor, and Living Saint were forced to turn away from the shrine and defend it from a Black Legion Terminator assault, and as the Ultramarines were locked in combat with the traitors, Call and Ivrain did the unthinkable. They killed the stasis fields surrounding the Primarch, and Call's auto-reliquary unfolded, engulfing the throne. Calgar tried to reach them to stop this sacrilege, but the forces of Chaos were reinforced by flocks of raptors and Dreadclaw drop pods carrying Khorne berserkers, and the press of bodies was too tight. The Ynnari and the Archmagos had turned to join the battle as the lights on the machine flickered from red to green and the panels of the auto-reliquary folded back. They revealed the Primarch, Roboute Guilliman, clad in a new suit of armour and holding the Emperor's sword, alive once again. With the Primarch at their side, the Chaos Strike Force was quickly defeated, and Guilliman accepted command of the Ultramarines chapter from Calgar and swiftly turned the tide of the war. With Macragge secured for now, he then set about learning as much as he could about what had happened in the last 10,000 years, and particularly in his opinion, how far the Imperium had fallen. News of his return spread fast, something the Primarch was initially uncomfortable with, Space Marine chapters sending delegations to confirm the rumours, and synods of the ecclesiarchy descending to proclaim him a son of the God Emperor, something that greatly discomforted him since the Imperium he remembered was a secular one. And Imperial institutions weren't the only ones who heard the news. During a victory parade on Macragge, he defeated an assassination attempt by agents of the demon Primarch Fulgrim. The war pushed on to liberate the rest of Ultramar, but while the defenders weathered the storm, they fell into a stalemate as the realm was afflicted by a demon pox known as the Weeping, something that only the presence of the Primarch seemed to be able to hold back, as if it was designed to keep him busy behind the lines. Eventually, Guilliman realised that he was being played, and the only way to make the scale of impact needed would be to push outwards from Ultramar, to try and reach Terra itself and rally the forces of the entire Imperium. And so the Terran Crusade began, formed of 3 companies of Ultramarines led by Cato Sicarius and supported by detachments from many other chapters, the Grey Knights of Voldus, Amalric and his Black Templars, the Saint, Inquisitor Greyfax, and the forces of Archmagos Call. But the warp storms caused by the fall of Cadia and the emergence of the Great Rift were still raging, and their journey was to become something of an odyssey. At the edge of the warp storm known as the Maelstrom, they were assaulted again by the forces of the Thousand Suns, this time led by the Primarch Magnus the Red, who wove a spell that scattered the fleet deep into its warp-churn depths. Lost, the damaged fleet cast about for a bearing. They were taunted with tales of how the Imperium burned 4 Emperor's Children warbands on planets of twisted flesh and came into conflict with the greater demon of Tzeentch, Kairos Fateweaver, in the crystal forests of Bathamor. They fought against renegade Astartes raiders and demonic fleets until, eventually, guided by a ghostly image of a Harlequin Shadowseer, they found a route that seemed promising. But as the much-reduced fleet finally reached the edge of the Maelstrom and picked their way through the great graveyard of starships that crowded its perimeter, they were ambushed and finally captured by Fateweaver and his allies, the Red Corsairs. The hundreds of captured Space Marines, Grey Knights, and the Primarch himself were imprisoned aboard the Red Corsairs' stronghold, another of the famed Blackstone fortresses, gifted to them centuries earlier by Abaddon the Despoiler in return for their loyalty. But though the demon Fateweaver intended to hold them there until a useful opportunity arose, their imprisonment didn't last long. A burning comet fell upon the station in the form of Skarbrand of Khorne and his demonic legions, still angry from the incident on Ursulia and, generally. As the Red Corsairs were occupied defending their fortress from swarms of bloodletters, Solandri Veilwalker appeared aboard, accompanied by another mysterious figure, Cypher, the fabled Lord of the Fallen Dark Angels. In return for passage to the throne room of the Emperor, Cypher freed the prisoners and, together with Veilwalker and the spectral figures of the Legion of the Damned, they fought through waves of demons of Tzeentch and Khorne to reach the Webway portal at the centre of the Blackstone Fortress. Escaping into the Webway, the rest of their journey was harried at every turn by the forces of Tzeentch, Thousand Sons and their Zangor servants assaulting the crusade at every turn. But, led by the Harlequins of the Veiled Path, they finally made it to a Webway gate secreted on Terra's moon, Luna. And the fighting spilled out onto the surface. As the Imperials attempted to consolidate their position and seal the gate, a great figure clawed its way through the portal, Magnus the Red, come to finish what he'd started on the other side of the Maelstrom. Another huge battle broke out on the airless surface of Luna, rubric marines and demonic horrors of Tzeentch bounding across the dunes under fire from Ultramarines, Grey Knights and the Sisters of the Living Saint. Guilliman fought his brother Magnus, barely holding out against waves of dark magic, until eventually the void lit with fire as the colossal system defences of humanity's homeworld moved into position. Naval monitors fired on the demonic forces, screaming drop pods from the Imperial Fist chapter slammed into the dust, and squads of Sisters of Silence deployed from their citadels, and the Imperial forces rallied, forcing the remnants of the Thousand Sons back through the gate and the Harlequins sealing it behind them. The Primarch had finally reached the solar system. In the days that followed, Guilliman became the centre of a whirlwind of activity. He was borne to the Imperial Palace, which itself had not escaped the fighting, arriving at the climax of what became known as the Second Battle for Terra, one of the largest demonic incursions in known history, where the forces of Khorne had taken advantage of the blackness in the warp and the failure of the Astronomicon and besieged the palace itself. At the doors to the throne room of the Emperor, Celestine and Greyfax finally departed. Guilliman betrayed Cypher, allowing the custodians to imprison the fallen rather than risk the Dark Angel's presence in the throne room, though Cypher would mysteriously disappear again shortly after. Inside, alone, the Primarch communed with his father for a full night and day cycle. For the first time in 10,000 years, the fractured and disembodied remnants of the Emperor's psyche pulling themselves together to attempt communication. What was said is unknown, but as he emerged, the Primarch called a meeting of the High Lords of Terra. To them, he claimed the Emperor's personal mandate and impressed his authority as the new Lord Commander of the Imperium. The Imperium was split in two, whole sectors gone dark or lost behind the spreading warp storms of the Cicatrix Maledictum, and as the forces of chaos rose, so too did the various real space enemies of the Imperium. New fleets would be built, new armies raised, and terrible weapons unleashed from the vaults of Belisarius Cawl on Mars, and the Imperium would push back in a new crusade, the Indomitus Crusade. And that's it. The events of Gathering Storm stop there, but we know what was going to come next. The new and terrible weapons unleashed by Cawl would turn out to be the Primaris Space Marines, developed from the ancient Selenar Magna Mater, captured in the last days of the Horus Heresy. The Sisters of Silence and Adeptus Custodes joined the Crusade fleets along with these new armies, and as they pushed out across the galaxy, they'd discover the spread of the Cicatrix Maledictum and shore up the defences of the new Imperium Sanctus, that which remained on Terra's side of the rift. All this would be covered in later campaigns and novel series. The Watchers of the Throne series starts during the Second Battle for Terra and deals with the political fallout from the re-emergence of the Primarch. The Dawn of Fire series details the start of the Indomitus Crusade, and the Dark Imperium series, the Plague Wars against Mortarion. But for now, the setup for 40k's new progressing timeline was complete. Anyway, hopefully that fills in some gaps for veteran players and sets up the world a bit better for newcomers. Many of the other big 40k campaign events either paved the way for this one or developed its themes further in the next few years, so I'm planning to do similar summaries for those and maybe an overarching timeline too. So yeah, stay tuned, click the links and subscribe if you want to see them. Thanks for watching. And as I said, if you'd like to see more, there are plenty of lore videos on my channel. Some of them will be popping up just there on the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, there are affiliate links to stores and a link to my Patreon in the thing below. See ya.